In this video, we're going to take a look at how we get our different pieces for our environment and pull them into Unreal Engine 4 and set up different aspects like what we see here for parallax and different kind of layering of elements in here. So let's go ahead and get started, and we'll hop on over into Photoshop and take a look at our textures. So here we are inside of Photoshop, and we've got our different layered files here. So basically what I've got is this mountains kind of set up back and through here, and I want to isolate the mountains, and I want to separate the clouds that we see here and some of these mid-ground elements. So the first thing that I need to do, at least for the mountains, because I'm pulling in some colors from the sky, if we take a look at this group that we have here, it's on 70% opacity, so that means it is pulling some of the different colors that you see from this background here. So I need to separate the background from everything else, so I'm just going to hide everything that I've got on these different layers right here like that, and I'm going to turn on this sky grad. I'll select all, so that's Control A, and I'm going to copy merge, so it's going to copy everything in that selection. Control Shift C will do a copy merged. Now I can make a new document. I'm just going to hit Control N and then make a new document, hit enter for that, and I'll hit Control V to paste, and it should paste that that background that we just copied. I want to make this document a little bit smaller, Control Alt minus, just to get this a little bit smaller through here. And then now I can take the whole group that I have for my mountains and just hold down Shift and then drag it over into here, and it should snap into place for me. The reason it's going to snap into place is because you know, I've got a document that this is the same exact size as this one here. When I hold Shift, it's going to snap it into place for me. So I'll just go ahead and take the opacity of this, and I'll put it to 100% like this. And really what I need to do is start getting each one of these things separated out. So one other thing I want to point out to you, if I zoom in on here, what I did with these is actually took some of the mountains that are in the back. So if we take a look, these are all in the front, this one's in the back, so is this one here. The ones in the back actually have been blurred a bit to sell a little bit more of the depth on there. So I do have some difference between the different art on here like this. So if we take a look at this one, that's a front one, this is back, this is back, back like that. And so I copied this into a new document that you see in through here, and it's basically like this, what we got here on this part. Now if I did this where I hold down Control and select the transparency of something like that, and I do a copy merged, I can do Control Shift C like that, and I'll make a new document and I'll paste it in there, Control V like that. It should be picking up some of the colors that we had from that background. Now if I hide the background on here and then just double up on this thing like this a couple times and then merge all these things down, I'm going to hold down Shift and select this, hit Control E, and that'll merge that down. You can see it's still has transparency down here, but it's you know, getting a lot more dense in through here. And that's definitely what I found for going and pushing it in the game engine, that you do want some transparency, but you don't want it to go too transparent through there, because if you have one mountain in front of the other, you start to see parts of that and things like that. So that's how I kind of isolated this. I isolated all the different pieces on here, and let's take a look at this card. So what I ended up doing was taking the first mountain that I had, and then I duplicated it and then pushed it down here. So I had a sharp version and then a blurred version that you see here. And then I just pushed this down and I redrew some different types of mountains. So they all looked very similar, but you know, they have a little bit different thing going on for the peaks and things like that. So I got a sharp version and a blurred version. If I hold down Alt and click on here, you can see this document is 4096 by 4096. Probably didn't need it this size, and actually in game there's some ways within the texture to just go ahead and reduce the size. So I think in game it's actually showing it 2048 by 2048. But if I have the art high res, I might as well build it high res and then just pull it in and have Unreal lower the resolution for me. So the other thing is, if I hit Control R, you can see we got a ruler here, and we can drag this thing out, and then this should snap right in the middle. So I definitely wanted to make sure that I had some things set up for myself, some different guides to make sure that I was staying within a certain quadrant. So I took all these and divided them in half as well, so I could make sure that I've got 8 things on a page like this. Then just saving this out, you could save it out as a PNG if you hide the background on there. That's a possibility. The other thing that you could do is make sure you can save it as a target file. Let me see if I have the alpha channel in here. Yeah, so I do. So to make the alpha channel, that's pretty simple. If you want to save it as a target file, I can just go to RGB here. If I hold on Control and then click on all these, if I hold on Control and then add the Shift modifier to it, I can keep adding to the selection like you see here. Or the other thing I did, I actually took all the pieces and I duplicated them and then merged them down into one sheet. And then at that point I can hold on Control and select it, and I can select all the transparency for it. Then if we just go to Channels, we can click on this and make a new channel from selection like that, and you can see it's just going to make a new alpha channel for you. And when you save this out, if you save it as a target file, make sure you save it as 32-bit so it contains that alpha channel for the transparency. So that's how to set up a transparent card like this, and I'm getting a lot of variation on this, so I'm able to take these 4 different mountain types and then maybe flip them horizontally. And with that, with a front and a blurred version, I was getting some pretty good variation out of that. So the same process that was done for the mountains was also done for the different clouds that I had. So if we take a look at that real quick, if we take a look at the clouds on the sky, I can just hold down Shift and drag this over and here and turn this on, and I think it didn't snap correctly because I had a selection for the mountains on there. So let's do it one more time. Hold down Shift, drag it over, and everything should snap into place for the clouds. Now, I think I talked about this in an earlier video. I have some masks on here because I wanted to draw these things and get them to look like this cloud sitting in front of this. So I just painted on the mask for that. So if I hold down Shift and click on that mask to hide it, you can see here's the actual clouds. So same process, I had to kind of flatten these things down, and then I pulled them over into this sheet over here. So on this sheet, if I hide this, you can see here's actually what was made for the clouds on here. I'm just putting this color back here because I'm saving it out as a target file, and I wanted to have a color back behind here that kind of matched the other clouds. So that's something that's kind of important to talk about. This mountain sheet, I said if you could save it as a target file. What would be best is if I did that, if I went on here like this and I actually made a solid color, and I'll just give it a color like this for right now, and I'll put it at the very bottom of this thing. So let me push it down. I'll just put it under this flat thing, and now I'll select a color that's really close to all the colors in the mountain. So maybe something like that on here. The reason for this is because if you don't give it some color that kind of matches the overall color of this, you can end up getting some white and fringe and maybe some colors right along the edges, and you wouldn't really want that. So that's why you would set up something like that. So I was having pretty good luck saving things out as a PNG file, so if you don't want to worry about some of that stuff, you can save it as a PNG and make sure the background's hidden on it. But to be super safe, I was making sure I was saving as a target file with the alpha map, and that seemed to work pretty good. So again, here's the same process for this, and I've got an alpha map for this. So this is, wherever it's white, it's going to be opaque and draw the clouds, and wherever it's black, it's going to be hiding those areas and through there. And I did the same thing for these mid cliffs that we see here. So if I turn these on right in through there, I pushed these over and then actually separated out this image. So this was all one image, and then I cut these pieces out and kind of redrew them just a little bit. And you can see I gave it that big color in the back, but really this is what it looks like with the transparency on it. So all these different pieces gives me enough to start kind of playing with. So that's the texture setup. Let's go ahead and we'll take a look over at Maya, and then we'll be able to see about setting up some of the different geometry cards for this. Alright, here we are inside of Maya, and if you take a look, here's some of the different elements as they've been put together. And if I rotate the camera back, you might start to be able to see exactly how this thing is built. So we've got this depth kind of going on, and the thing furthest away from the camera is obviously the thing that's in the the very back there. I did notice that if you want something to feel a bit more stationary, the further that it gets away from the camera, it's going to feel as if it doesn't move that much when you move the camera around, when you're looking at it kind of here. But what also matters is as you push it back further away from the camera to get it to fill the entire space, it needs to grow in scale. So you're going to have to make some of the elements in the very background very, very large. So you can see here some of the different sizes of the clouds and things like that right now for things. I'm going to take this off of reference for everything so I can actually start to select things. And I could turn on the wireframe on shaded option here so you can actually see the cards that were generated for this. So the process is very, very similar to what we did for the character. We're just going to make a new material and pull it in and make a flat card, and then use the multi-cut tool and then cut those different pieces out. And then once we have the pieces made, we can start to position them in the world. So if I go ahead and if I hide some of these objects, so let me go ahead and turn off the visibility of these things, and I have something prepared for us in the outliner. If I go here to the outliner and show this real quickly, what I've got here under the geometry section under background, I've got this thing for creating the mountain cards that we see here. So I'll just show them. I'll show just one of them at a time for this. So again, we've got our texture map that we looked at inside of Photoshop and saved that out as either a PNG or a targa map. That's got alpha on there. If I hit Control A to bring up the attribute editor for that and show the material, you can see that the color texture has been piped into this area here, and this is what the texture looks like. If I go back one level here, the alpha of that is fed into the transparency of that, so it's just that same map. So that's the material for this thing, and that material is just assigned to that card. It's pretty simple to make a card setup. You can just go to Create, Polygon Primitives, go to Plane, go to the option box for that. Depending on how big you want this thing, you can set the width or the height and how many divisions you have on there. So I think these are similar to some of the settings that I use for that. The size doesn't really matter at the beginning because you're just kind of cutting this thing up. And so once you have the plane made, you can just select in object mode. So you can right click over this, say object mode, and then hold down shift, right click, and go to the multi-cut tool, and then start cutting through these different areas. Once everything's kind of sliced up, I'll show the next card on this. I'll hide that one, show this one here. You can see I just went through and selected all the faces on this. So as I right click on there and go to face, I could select all the faces that were in here and just select them and delete them. Now the next step is actually you can take the verts on here. Let me tap B to get my soft selection off of that. I want to split all these objects apart, so I can take these edges that you see here, so we can right click on there and go to edge, and I can select this edge here, hold down shift to add to my selection, and select these different pieces on here. I'll go to the modeling menu set that we have here, and we'll go ahead and take a look at this. There's under edit mesh, you can use the detach, and after you detach that, it keeps it all in one object, but it separates those elements at those locations. So what you end up with, I think these are still welded together. Let me just select one of the verts. I actually have detached those already. So that's what happens after you detach it. It gives you a vert here and a vert here like that. They're still going to be in the same position over the top of each other, so you can always check that after you detach and then just move the verts around. Now, really what's going on is after we detach those, it's all still one object, but we basically have these different islands like this. And so after we have that, if we go into object mode, so I can tap F8 to go back into the object mode, or we can right click on there and go to object mode. We can go to the mesh and say separate. And whenever we do that, it's going to make this next thing that we'll take a look at here. So you got this group here. I'll unhide that. And it basically takes this one piece, gives it the same name, puts it into a group, and gives you all these different pieces. It's probably going to have some transform nodes on there, so you want to select all the different pieces and then delete the history. That's Alt-Shift-D will delete the history on that for you. Once that is finished up, let me hide this piece here. I'll hit Control-H for that. I'll show this one, Shift-H, and I believe I have these on a layer, so I'll turn on the visibility of the layer. And all I did at that point was take each one of these and make sure that the pivot was centered on that. So you can select any of the objects that you saw on this list here and just select it and then go to Modify and say Center Pivot, like that. And so once you've done it for one of them, you can just run through and tap G for each one of them, and it'll run through and select those and center the pivot on it. Then I took the grid, turned the grid on, and I just took these and snapped them all to the center. So I've got some animation keys on this. So at frame -100, I set this here and drug the time slider over here. I just took all the pieces and actually snapped them right to the center of the grid. And then I keyed that at -100. So I can just come up here and select this, hold down Shift, select all these, and then right click and say key selected. And that's going to give me my keyframe at a -100. So if I need to export all these things out, I can just grab them like this and then go File, Export Selection as the FBX. And but then I still want to use these pieces inside of Maya and just kind of get an idea of if they're working and everything else like that. So at frame 0, you can see I'm giving it a new position. So I just basically moved all these things into the position where I wanted it at frame 0, like this, and then keyed their position like that, like we just looked at. And then that gives us this thing right here, like this. Now if I take my my range slider here and put this at 0, or I can drag this over like that, I'll put that as 0. Now it looks like everything's going to be in place for me and everything else like that, and I can start to bring back some of these other elements. Like I've got the dino character kind of there, and he animates through on this. So I'm using those negative frames just to hold that export position for stuff. But that's how these cards were made and then exported out. Let's go into Unreal now, and we'll take a look at about how we get those pieces in and start to build our materials and things like that for it. Okay, here we are inside of Unreal Engine 4, and let's start taking a look at this setup that we have here. So if we start to kind of pan around, you can see we've got a very similar setup to what we had in Maya. Obviously the scale is a bit different. I definitely wanted it to feel as if, at least for this beginning part, that I could move across quite a few different game screens. So just something that was put in here was just a very basic cube, and you can see if I select this thing and take a look at the size of this thing and the location. This is the type of scale that we're using for something like this, and I'm able to, like when I play on this, I can just go left and right, and it's a pretty good, decent amount of space to kind of check everything out for the art. So the reason you don't see my player character, I went into the blueprint for the side scroller and just went into the visibility of the character and hid that. So that's why it's kind of showing up that way like this. But this gives me the kind of the layout and the spacing that I'm going to want, and you can see the scale that we're kind of working against here. So I'm treating these as these mid-ground kind of cliffs that we have in here. And you can see if I select this, kind of where we're at for placement on this. So it's pretty far back in the world. If you look in the position in X, which is going back this way, it's almost at 5,000 for that. And you can see there is a little bit of parallax going on between this. So if you even give these pieces a little bit of spacing in between, you can actually get a little bit of parallax in between each one of the sections that we have here. If we move on back to the mountains, which are even further back, and we'll select one of these and see where their position is. So you can see they're almost at 50,000 units away on there, and the scale is pretty large on that for that.
but you can see there is depth within this as well. So you can see there's quite a bit of space in between each one of these mountains that we have here, and I put the blurrier ones in the back and then the more sharp ones in the front. And we have our cloud kind of set up like that, so you can see there is distance in between that and then the big shape that we have for the background. So I'll tap 1 and come here again, and I'll go in and play the game. I'll hit Alt-P and then just start to move around a little bit. So if you notice those mountains in the back, there is parallax on that, but it does move rather slowly. So that's kind of the setup that you want. You want the things in the very, very far background to have maybe a little bit of parallax, but not tons of movement. So you can see if I jump with the character, I can even get that separation for this mid-ground, what I'm saying for these kind of cliff faces in here. And if you look closely at those, again, those have a little bit of parallax going on with them as well. Not tons of parallax, but just enough to give you this illusion that things are set up in kind of a way to where there is some depth even within that particular area. So you want to be careful about, you know, how much space you're introducing. If it's too far back on here like this, then you're going to get a lot of parallax on there. If they're too close together, you could potentially get some Z fighting. That is a possibility. But I want to show you how to set this up as far as rendering for the sorting order on this. So with this version of Unreal, I'm on 4.8, but I think this hit a little bit earlier. If you go to Edit, and then you go to your project settings, and let's pull this over on here and take a look at this. If we go to rendering and open that up, you can see that there's an area for translucency sorting order. So we're using full transparency on our materials, and I'm going to show you this in just a little bit when we take a look at the materials. But with this sorting order of our objects, we can sort along an axis. And so if we kind of rotate this a little bit and kind of see, X is pointing this direction. If you remember the values on our cards and things like that, as we push them back in the world, we were actually pushing them back in negative X. So we've got this sorting order, and we're sorting along an axis, and we are sorting it along a negative 1 in the x-axis. So it's basically going to sort from back to front. So whatever's back here, it's going to draw that, and then it's going to draw these elements over the top of it, just like the way that we want. So that's something at least about for the sorting part of this. Something else while I'm in here that I might as well talk about that's pretty important that I found is when you start moving your game around, if you don't have your anti-aliasing turned on to FXAA, you'll get a really kind of nasty kind of blurring effect on all your textures. So maybe in a 3D game you'd actually want that, but for the 2D stuff it just doesn't really work all that well. So make sure for your default post-processing settings you set that to FXAA. And make sure that's on. Something else to kind of speed things up, if you turn off the ambient occlusion, at least I don't want to use it for the stuff that I'm doing with this 2D art, so you don't need that on there. You could turn off motion blur as well, but if you want to play around with having those on, you could try that. You know, you could also turn off that auto exposure so it doesn't do any kind of difference with eye adaptation for the lighting information. So you can set those up. Now, if you do a post-process node within the world, which I did make that, and I made a folder for that, and actually put the post-process volume in here. So if you don't have a post-process volume, you can actually take that and throw it into the world right here like that. And I'm just going to go to this thing and go to the bottom and go to that post-process volume and put it to unbound. So if it's unbound, it just means that it's going to fill the entire world. You see this box that's in here? This is actually the post-process volume. So it's possible for you to do effects to the screen and things like that, depending on this volume. And if your character is within it, it'll do that volume. And if you've got another one over here, you can actually get a difference between moving between the two. But I'm just going to have one post-process volume for the entire game, so that's why it's set to unbound. And then if you go to these different post-process settings, you can see that there's a lot of different stuff to kind of play around with in here. I believe under MISC is the anti-aliasing mode. So again, if you have a post-process volume, make sure that you're checking this and you have this AA method selected. If it's not checked off, I believe it defaults to that default post-process thing that we just looked at. But make sure it's set to the FX AA like that. And trying to think if there's anything else kind of important in here for this. I did crank up the bloom settings a little bit. I wanted elements to feel like they kind of glowed a little bit, like for the sun and things like that. So I think if I turn that off, you can see kind of a little bit of the difference that you would see on there, and it maybe makes these things kind of stand out a little bit. So that's that for the transparency sorting and talking about making sure that these things render nice and crisp within the world on there. So let's talk about actually getting the work in. And basically I've got this thing where I made a whole folder for background elements and made a new folder for that, for the mountains within here. And then within this, I made materials and my meshes, and then the particles and sounds and textures, things like that. So under the meshes, once I made that folder, just right-click in there and say import, and I'm going to, go and find that FBX file that I made. So because I had multiple cards selected whenever I exported out from Maya using the FBX exporter, it's going to export all those different cards, and they're going to be seen as separate objects. Whenever you pull them in, though, let's take a look here. If I go and find mountain cards like this and open that, you can see that we have this thing right in here where we can combine meshes. Now, if you wanted to take all your models and actually combine them all into one mesh, you would use that option. But for what we're doing, we want to keep them as separate objects like that. I didn't export out any of the materials or textures with it. It's possible within your FBX exporter inside of Maya, there's an embed section within there that you can go. It's toward the bottom, and you can actually embed a material that you have from Maya, and it'll embed the textures too. I was keeping all that stuff separate just so I can make sure I could pull that stuff easily later on and not kind of worry about it. So these really are the settings that I put on there. I didn't want any kind of collision on there either, so I just turned that auto generate collision off. So let's cancel that real quick. And when they came in, they're not going to have a material because there was no material created. Mine's going to have that on there now, but I'll just show you kind of some of the steps that I went through right off the bat. So you can see that if you open up the mesh for this, it does have a material because I've created a material for that, and you would pipe it into these pieces after you're done. So you just select your material after it's been created. Let me move this over just a little bit. You would just select it like this, and then just click this little arrow thing to populate that area with the material, and that's what you do a little bit later. I'm turning off this cast shadows and enable collision because these are just visual elements in the very back. I don't want them to mess with the camera at all, and I don't want them to actually cast any shadows because we're doing some weird stuff with the scale to get this parallax thing to render correctly. So you could have a light back behind this thing and it would catch shadow, and who knows what it would do. So just turn that stuff off. So once that's set up for the different pieces, I had to go through each one of those meshes like this and do that same setup for each one of them. Let's move on to the material now and take a look at this. So what I created was a parent material and a material instance. So a parent material is just, we're going to look at all the different things for actually making that material. Once you have a material instance set up, you basically, in the parent material, you are exposing certain values that you want to give to yourself or other users like on your team and things like that. And so I've built in some stuff to make it possible to darken these pieces if I want, or I could actually lighten them or tint them or something. Say I wanted it to feel like there's a kind of fog on these things, I could actually kind of lighten things based off of that if I want to introduce those. I'll just pull that back down and hit cancel for that. And again, with the darken thing, It's just a color and it's being multiplied over the top of that, and I can introduce, you know, color to it and darkness like that. Cancel for that. And I also set up a control to be able to fade the opacity on the thing, so I could dial that in and out if I wanted to. It obviously doesn't make much sense to have a transparent mountains, but if this was on the very back mountains, maybe that would work okay. So that's why I put those controls in there like that. But there's still the clouds back behind even these back mountains, so it'd be a little bit tricky. The whole reason I would even put this kind of control in there is to make it feel as if the atmosphere is kind of covering up those mountains, but it's possible that you could just do that with this color lightning thing that I've got there. So I'll go ahead and I'll just save it. Made a few changes to that. So that's the material instance. So let's take a look at the parent material. This is the original material that was set up. I just wanted you to have an understanding of, when we look at this parent material, why certain things were done to give that ability to kind of change those values on the fly. So I'll open this up, double click on this, and we'll look here. And it's pretty simple. I don't want any kind of lighting information to be affecting these pieces, so if you click in the open viewport here, or you actually select this node here, you can start to change the shading model that you see here. So the shading model is set to default lit, and I could do unlit. That would give no lighting information at all if you don't want that. Now, since I am putting it on default lit, that just means it can receive lighting information, but you see there's nothing being piped into the base color. Everything's being put into this emissive color area, and if you use the emissive color area, it doesn't matter what kind of lighting is going on, it's going to pull all color information from a texture or whatever gets piped into that area. So you could be in a complete black dark shadow area, and depending on your map, you know, if you take a look at these mountains, it would draw exactly like what you see with the texture, because it's just overriding any kind of lighting information. So I could use either one of those methods for this. I could use the unlit or the default lit and still plug it in emissive. Just depends on what you want to do with this. So here's my texture sample, right? And so to bring in the textures, same kind of thing. We're just going to right click in there and say import. You're going to have to go navigate to the area for the texture, right? And so I was using a target file because I was saving the alpha channels with that. So actually, I think for this one I used this. Maybe I used a PNG for that. Yeah. So for the mountains, I actually used a PNG. So the PNG's got the transparency just kind of embedded directly in the file. So either way, if you pull in a PNG or a target file, Unreal's gonna treat it the same way, where it's going to have this alpha slot. So you can just take the texture, click and drag it into the material that you've created. And just to make sure nobody's confused on how to create the material, you just can go to that section, right click on there and say material. You can make a brand new material there. You see there, and you can give it a name. I'm just gonna go ahead and delete that. But that's how the material is created. Double click and open that up for the material, and then we got our texture, and we can just pull that thing in, right? And so I could just bypass all these things. I'll show you what those controls are in just a second, but this could just be piped into emissive, and then your alpha could be just piped into opacity like that. That's a possibility for you, and that's going to be like the most basic kind of setup, but what I want to show you is how to add those different controls that we have here. So basically with this texture, I'm interrupting this flow that we have here into the emissive slot, and I'm interrupting that with a color, and I can darken the color with a multiply, and I can either lighten the color with an add node. So any of these nodes is pretty simple. You can just right click in here and you can start to type MUL for multiply, and you can find the multiply node like that. If you right click and say add, you can find that. Pretty simple, right? And there's also hotkeys for this stuff. So if you hold down M and click, you're going to get a multiply node like this, and if you hold down A and click, you'll get the add node. So there's nice little hotkeys for stuff like that. This is a constant vector 3. So if I right click on it here and say con for constant, here's a constant 1, con constant vector 2, and I could keep going on this, and it goes up to 4, right? Or I could just hold down 1, tap, 2, tap, 3, tap, and 4, tap, like this. So this could be useful for, this is just a single value, right? So this this works well, you know, for, like, say you wanted to multiply with just a value. So if you multiply by 1, it's going to give you the same result. If I multiply something by 0, it's going to make the thing pitch black, because the value of 0 multiplied by whatever is going to give you that black kind of color. 2 values, something like texture coordinates. So if I go right click and say text and then do chord, I can find text chords like this, and you can see that this has got a U and a V. It's got 2 values in here. So if I took this and multiplied, I'm going to hold down M and drag this into this slot here, and I took this 2 values and piped it in here, I could change the tiling rate. I could do 4 and 4 for, it looks like red and green, but really you're just feeding values into this thing. And if I fed that into the UVs of that, you should be able to see this texture repeat now 4 times in the U and 4 times in the V, and I can actually change that rate and make them different from each other, something like this. Now it's tiling 2 times, and then should be tiling 12 times on there. If you set it just to 1 into 1, then that's going to give you the same thing that you got here for the tiling. So that's something for 2 values. If you want to do something with 3 values, if you double click on this, you can see it's actually, you can use it as picking colors. So red, green, and blue. And the values go all the way up to 1 for red, green, and blue. Okay. Now, if you've got something that's got 4 values, you could use that for red, green, blue, and then a value for alpha. Okay. You don't have to use it for that. You could just use it as 4 different channels if you want, but that's kind of where those nodes are coming from. So I just tapped 3 and then made this here, made this here. Now, to convert them into parameters that can be used in the material instance later, you have to convert these. So you can just take one of these nodes and right click over it and say convert to parameter. When you do that, it gives you the ability to give that parameter a name. So you just come over here and give this a name. So I call this color darken for this one, and I did the same process for this thing. Right click, convert to parameter, gave it a name, color lighten. And so you can see I'm running this out, the color into this multiply slot A, and then the color from the texture into slot B. So if I take this texture and I multiply it by pure white, it's like multiplying it by a value of 1. So, you know, any number or value multiplied by 1 is going to give you the same result back. So that's why the color white has no effect. But if I want to start darkening it, I can push that down towards a color or push it away from white, and it starts to add or multiply that color on top of it. So the adding thing is going to add the color on here. So that's why I'm starting off with something black. If I take this texture and I add black to it, it's not going to add any kind of light to it or anything, you know. Now as I start pushing that away from black, it's going to add that color and then that value and start to lighten the thing. So I'll just pipe that into the emissive color. And now for this opacity, this is where I just took this and interrupted it with a multiply node. So I take the opacity that's working and it knocks out the mountains, and then I just multiply that by a scalar, which is if you hold down 1 and you click, this is just a value, we can right click on that and say convert to parameter, right? And so we can give it a name, and I called it opacity fade, and we can give it a value, and I just made it a value of 1. That's one way of doing it. If you want to do the hotkey for it, you can hold on S and then click, and then this automatically gives you a parameter value that you can change. So either way you want to do it. And then I'm just interrupting that with this multiplication of this opacity fade into the opacity. So that's this shader. This is this this thing here. Now to get to this opacity here, let's talk about transparency real quick on here. So if I click anywhere in here, or I click on this node, again, I get to see the different parameters for this shader. And you can see the blending mode is set to translucent. Translucent gives you full transparency, full gradation of transparency, right? And so I can come here. The default is just opaque. And if I put it on opaque, you can see here's what we've got here. So it looks pretty nasty, right? It's just pulling the color from this texture, and there's no transparency whatsoever. But if we pull it on that translucent, it opens up this opacity slot, and we get to pipe in the alpha into that area. Now if it's set on masked, like what we looked at for the characters, it's going to give you an on-off value for transparency. There won't be any gradation if it's, I'm not sure what the threshold is on that, but it takes the values and it pushes it to either be pure white or pure black. Now you can see it broke the shader when we changed this to masked, and the reason for that is because this masked version uses opacity mask. So I could pipe that into here at that point, and you can see here's what it did. It's going to cut off this thing here, but we don't get that nice gradient at the bottom of this. So now we can just switch that back to translucent, and I can switch between the two methods because I got this running back to these two different things here. It's grayed out because we're not using that opacity mask, but now this material's been set up. So I really wish this full translucent model worked currently with you know, a model that's made up of different pieces and is a skeletal mesh like what we've got for our main character, but it's just not possible currently. So maybe at a later time whenever you're viewing this video might not be an issue, and I really hope that's the case. But currently for any skeletal mesh, if you want transparency sorting to work with that, you need to use the masked version and not the translucent. So I'll go ahead and save that. So that's this material, and so hopefully you can see with this setup you should have a better understanding of how this material instance thing works now. So if we keep flipping back and forth between here, remember we've got this color darken that we made, color lighten, and opacity fade. The first time you use a material instance, you're going to need to check these boxes to enable it, and once they're enabled, then they're pretty much live. So I actually went back through, went to my meshes. Remember we talked about going into here to this area and then populating that with a material. After the material instance was made, I could go through and then go to my materials, select the material instance, and you could populate it right in this area. So any new piece of geo that you drag out into the world actually has the correct material on it, and it's already kind of set up. So I guess that's something else to kind of talk about is after it's all been set up and you've got the material working on it, you can click and drag it out to the world. You can see the scale of this stuff is pretty small, right? So it's a matter of kind of getting it in the right spot. Where does it need to sit in the world? Now, if we want to uniformly scale this, we can click this little icon here to lock all three axes together, and then we can start to go and give it the right kind of scale that we're looking for on here. And pushing that back. So I made different versions of this. I made a blurry version like we see here, and that one doesn't really work. I like the position of it, so let's go ahead and keep that, but I can go here. Here's my sharp version. So here's a kind of a cool thing. If I want to swap this model out with a different model, just select it here and then go over here into the properties of it and then click this little arrow to populate that mesh with a different mesh. So here now I've got my nice and sharpened version with this. Now I can tell that the version of the material that's on there is not the material instance because the material instance that I have is a bit darker. I can take that material and then just like swapping out the model, I can come here and swap out the material as well. So maybe I'll make this a little bit larger like this and through here, and then tap 1 because I've already got a camera set up for this, and then I can kind of see the scale of this thing a little bit better and how I would maybe lay this thing out. And then I'll just go ahead and play the game and take a look, and you can see I can check that against this. So one thing with this transparency at the bottom, you can see at the corners, you can tell it's doing this kind of weird visual trick where I've got transparency and it's kind of looks like it's floating in front of the other thing. So it's just something I got to kind of be aware of. So I'd have to probably really make more sense if this was pushed down a bit like this, and then it has the feeling as if maybe this is fog and kind of you know, the mountains are just peeking up through the different fog that's in here. So again, I'll hit Alt P to play, and again we're hitting F11 to do this. The reason I don't have a bar at the bottom is hit Shift F11, and that'll get rid of your taskbar at the bottom down there. So I'm just going to walk through here and just take a look. So that's basically the setup that was used to generate all these different pieces for the environment. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that out. But I did find that you're definitely going to need to spend quite a bit of time, you know, getting everything in the right spot, the right scale, and then the right distance from each other to produce the type of parallax that you're looking for. And the end results are they're actually pretty cool to look at, and it's kind of a fun process.